Most mom and pop investors are going to fall under two categories. The first, and then finally, probably the largest category, and this category includes. So most people who think their midterm rental will be passive, they don't have a bad property, but they made a few early decisions that require more work than they expected. And the successful property owners that I've worked with or that I've met, they have a plan for their midterm rental, and they have that plan from the beginning. And the reason for this is because you won't invest again, or you won't get the true value out of your property if you absolutely hate doing it. And I think coming up with a plan is a good way to avoid hating your rental property experience. In the 4 years that I've been meeting with new landlords about midterm rentals, one thing I've noticed is that some property owners new to the midterm rental model think that they can passively think about passive income. And that is not the way to approach this. And that's because a passive income property requires not only planning, but also knowing yourself. And for that reason, this video is going to cover how long you should rent out your monthly rental. And that's so you don't accidentally choose a rental length that actually creates more turnover, more work, and less actual passive income than what you had hoped for. The second thing we're going to talk about is which rules make sense versus which rules lose you business. And this is because some landlords will enforce policies that feel responsible to them, but they actually quietly push away the kind of renters that they ideally would want. And finally, we will cover how to know if renters can find your listing. And this should help landlords either falsely or accurately blaming pricing, seasonality, or the market when the actual issue is that your listing is effectively invisible. And in case you are wondering who I am, why I'm qualified to give you this advice, I have written 3 books on midterm rentals. I've had my own furnished monthly rentals since 2017, and I coach nationwide on this topic. Most people that have problems with passive midterm rentals, those problems come from choosing a rental length that conflicts with how the landlords or the rental property owners actually want to use the property. And what looks like a harmless preference, so blocking off certain months, shortening stays, or trying to stay flexible, this can all put you directly in competition with the rental base that you are trying to court. So basically, the renters and you are not aligned. And most mom and pop investors are going to fall under 2 categories. The first category is money maximizing landlords. So money maximizing landlords are relying on this property for cash flow. They need the income to live. And the second category is lazy landlords. And lazy landlords care about cash flow, but in addition to cash flow, the property has a different value for those landlords. And so the way they think about cash flow is a little bit different than money maximizing landlords would. And when we talk about those landlords having some other value for the property, what that can look like is these other landlords want to use the property occasionally for their own vacation interests. Or I've had clients that have purchased properties for their kids, but the kids aren't ready yet or don't need the property yet, so they're wanting to keep it rented. And then finally, probably the largest category, and this category includes renters, investors, landlords that believe that most real estate returns actually come from appreciation and not cash flow. In my experience, most rental property owners fall under the category of lazy landlording, and if they don't immediately fall under that camp, they eventually get there. And the reason for this is because most landlords or rental property owners have other interests, or they have an actual 9-to-5 job. And that means that they don't want to spend 14 hours on a weekend to squeeze out $80 more extra for the property for that month. And it's this last point where I see people start to get very disillusioned with their rental or the experience of being a landlord, property owner, etc. That's because at this inflection point, rental property owners are just spinning their wheels. They are reaching out to relocation service groups, trying to get an in with a nurse or an insurance contract. They're looking at lists of obscure travel nurse sites. They're adding their properties to those platforms, etc., etc. And none of this will work. It never does. I know you don't like hearing that, but it doesn't. But the good news is what does work is being on the big platforms and figuring out how to get traction on those rental platforms. And the reason why it's not working for you, if it hasn't been working for you yet, is because you have a strategy and positioning problem, not a reach problem and not a rental problem. This is good news, even if it may not feel like it yet. And the reason why it may not feel good yet is because this particular behavior, not having a plan and not getting reach on the platforms, costs landlords and property owners thousands of dollars. And that's not hyperbole, because the cost of a mortgage is usually well into the thousands each month. So every month that it sits, you're losing literally thousands of dollars. And this is also the price of learning without a framework. Because midterm rentals are a relatively new model, the best practices for how to price and list your midterm rental, they're not locked yet because it's not a widespread strategy that people use. And it's this learning period that costs a lot of new landlords, property owners, etc., valuable time and money. Even worse than that, though, new landlords start to feel a resentment toward the property because there's an inherent shame about that property not performing and them losing money every month. And so all of a sudden you made a smart decision, but it doesn't feel like a smart decision, and the stigma and the shame around it starts to stack up. When the reality is you likely have a property that would make some renter very happy, but you're new to this and you're losing money as you try to figure out how to attract renters and how to close the gap between your rental being available and the right renter that wants it. So just having clarity on what you want the property for will help, and then you can start making decisions around that. So for instance, as a property owner, you may be okay using it during high season because it would offset the cost that you would have to pay to book a hotel during that time. You might also be okay getting $50 less a month in rent because the person that you secured it for 4 months, 6 months, etc. And now you don't have to think about it, and you also don't have to worry about losing money with vacancy costs. Alternately, you might be a lazy landlord if you have other concerns for your life right now, or you believe that the real payoff for the property is appreciation and you just want to stop paying the mortgage. And once you believe these things, once you adopt that belief system, you can stop chasing down rabbit holes and start focusing on what really matters and what will really get you rented. And the good news here is that when your rental length is aligned with real demand patterns instead of personal timing, the turnovers drop, the communication required out of you will drop, the analysis of the listing constantly will drop, and with that, the property will finally start behaving the way that most people think a passive income property should act when they bought the rental property. So successful property owners, what they do is that they stabilize faster, and they accomplish this by having a plan and by being clear on what they want for the property. This doesn't always come to people naturally, so that's why I recommend being proactive and thoughtful about how you're going to get your property stabilized faster. And not just the property, to stabilize yourself as a landlord faster as well. All right, before we get to section 2, which will cover rules, are they smart? Are they helping you? Are they hurting you? Please like this video if you have learned something, or if you learned something during this video. If you are interested in consulting services, I offer 3 packages. One is a 1-hour package, one is the listing build, and one is the hold my hand mentor package, in which I stay on the listing through the first month of your first rental to make sure that there aren't further wrinkles that need to be ironed out after you've secured your first tenant. Also, if you're just looking for free stuff, I have lots of free stuff on the site. I have a free rental lease that breaks down the differences between midterm rentals versus unfurnished rentals, and also what each section in the lease means. I also have a checklist for furnishing your rental, as well as some other stuff. It changes all the time. The lease is always there. The second free product changes depending on when you watch this video. And you can find that link pinned to the top comment of this video. So a lot of midterm rental listings struggle because they come to the idea of renting and renters with these baked in assumptions or preferences that are actually quite counterproductive. To be more clear about this, a lot of new landlords have been educated to believe things that narrow the renter pool, and this delays finding renters, and that means that those landlords, those rental property owners, continue to pay the mortgage, and that is still your biggest threat as a landlord, and it is your biggest expense as a landlord, is vacancies. So what am I talking about? Well, there are some policies that feel responsible on paper, and there are some assumptions around renters that sound safer, and these assumptions and these policies often exclude the kind of tenants that you ultimately would want. These are the ones that stay longer, they cause less friction, they're pretty low key, and they make the rental actually enjoyable and passive, which I presume is everyone's goal that's watching this video. So I'm going to give an example here. You may or may not recognize yourself in this example, but if I do this right, you should recognize yourself in the pattern or recognize the issue with the pattern. So a good example of a rule that often hinders a landlord more than it helps the landlord is a no dog policy. I'm assuming people that have a no dog policy have a no dog policy because they've had a dog before and that dog either damaged their personal property, their primary residence, or rental property, or they know someone that has had this experience. And the experience was deeply unpleasant and it cost a bunch of money, and you're looking at your rental and thinking, well, I just got the floors redone and a dog would damage those, or I have carpet and I don't want a dog to pee on it, or it's a furnished rental. What if they chew on the sofa arm, etc.? And while I understand why new landlords have this concern, or why they have it in the back of their mind that like, no, I'm not going to let a dog in, that's obvious, the logic falls apart in modern times. And there's a couple reasons for this. One, a lot more people are having dogs as kids instead of actual kids. That's true for my husband and I. This is one of our 2 dogs. The second reason is that renters in the midterm rental space are probably working from home, so they can stay with their dogs. They're not abandoning the dogs all day, so there's less risk of damage. But I think more important to you is an evaluation of the risk and how things can go wrong, or how you might end up in a situation where you're paying the most money. So the way to think about this is, if I don't rent my place next month, I am paying a mortgage of $3,500 out of pocket. Now, if I rent to someone with a 7-year-old dog for 3 months that has lots of good reviews, do I actually believe that that dog is going to do $3,500 worth of damage to my property? Which one seems more likely? And I think once you ask yourself these questions or look at it that way, it helps clear up that question pretty quickly. It did for me, at least. And this isn't a static problem. We actually see new landlords carry these self-sabotaging beliefs into their new rental businesses, and these beliefs can compound over time. I think the dog example shows unbalanced risk, but it also suggests that landlords focus on the fear of a destructive dog instead of focusing on the cost of going unrented another month. And if you have a few of these misaligned expectations, the property is suddenly very passive because it hasn't been rented for the past 4 months. And just as a note, $3,500, so if your mortgage is $3,500, $3,500 times 4 months is $14,000. What would have to go wrong in your property to cause $14,000 worth of damage? And I think a lot of people come to this conclusion after they're comfortable renting for like a year or 2. But if you can shrink that timeline around some of these beliefs, you can avoid losing a lot of money. I like to call this section very expensive guessing. A lot of midterm rentals struggle because the owner can't clearly explain how a renter is actually supposed to find them. If you don't know where your listing appears, whether it's getting traffic, or why someone would book you instead of a different property, then you are guessing a lot of the time. And sometimes when you are guessing ends up looking like a slow market, or that you're having slow market conditions. And you really do not want to artificially create a slow market for your rental property. You really don't ever want to do that, but you especially don't want to create an artificial slow market for your rental property right now, because the actual market is actually slow. People really don't love hearing this, but the current lack of travel to the United States by Canadians and Europeans is having serious repercussions on the rental market in a lot of different regions. So we're seeing it in a lot of the Sun Belt states where snowbirds go. So like Arizona, Florida, the Southeast US. We're also seeing it in the northern part of the United States, like Michigan, Wisconsin, the Dakotas. We're seeing it in Washington State. We're seeing it in Michigan. We're seeing it in Vegas. Checked this last night, and Canadian traffic is actually down 20% for this time period, year over year, for 2025 compared to 2024. And some of my consulting clients have said to me, well, I've never rented to Canadians before, before, so it's not really an issue for me. And they make that assumption. That's a fair assumption to make if you have never rented to Canadians. But what is not correct is that it's not an issue for you. It is still an issue for you if you're in one of these markets. So the Canadians that rented someone else's place before are no longer coming. So now that rental is open, and that rental is competition to you that didn't exist before. Added to that, some of the Canadians that own properties in the United States won't come back to the United States, and so they are now renting out their places. And that means that you have a reduced renter pool and also more competition amongst landlords and available properties. The consequences of the lack of the Canadian traffic specifically is that your competition as a landlord just skyrocketed. Landlords that can clearly articulate how a renter will find them have adopted system level strategy, and this stops them from creating an artificially slow market for themselves. It's really about moving from small details to a big picture strategy. And a core component of your big picture strategy should be, where will people find me and why would they book my place over the neighbor's place? Passive income does not show up from caring less. Passive income comes from planning and from having the right systems set up. I hope that helps. If you want coaching, reach out. If not, I hope that you have a successful rental and that you make tons of money.